So to start with some technical detail. There is something called ODA, or Official Development Assistance, which is what counts as aid. And what counts as aid is set by a club of rich donor nations who get together under the aegis of the OECD and decide, okay, you can spend that much on aid. You can spend aid money on these things, but not those things. So when you tell everyone how much money you spent on aid this year, only certain things are eligible, right? And there are these national targets. At the moment in the UK, it's 0.5% of gross national income. It used to be 0.7%, but it was recently reduced. Now, what counts as overseas development assistance has always been subject to kind of constant renegotiation as the meaning of development changes and as what those donors want to achieve changes. So back in the 60s, it was pretty loose, right? And at the time that Guinea, Mozambique, Angola were involved in wars of independence against the Portuguese colonizers, all of the Portuguese assistance to those territories was counted as official development assistance, counted as aid, right? So at that time it was pretty expansive. Slowly, military spending and so on was removed. And then since 1988, donors started allowing spending on refugees in your own country to count towards your aid spending, right? And that's what's going to be at the centre of what I'm going to talk about here. But also just to drive home the links between aid spending and Britain's colonial past, another theme we're all here to think about and talk about, you can see this quite clearly in the aid budget, right? So the first accounts from DFID in 1998, £138 million of the aid budget then went to pay the pension payments of former colonial civil servants in now independent nations, right? So it doesn't take a lot of imagination, a lot of research to draw that line directly. The payment is now down to about $1 million a year. Obviously, there's fewer colonial civil servants around to draw their pensions. So where this hit the news in the last few days, some of you may have noticed, is there was a report from Parliament and from the Independent Commission on aid impact that showed that it looks like about a third of the aid budget this year, £3.5 billion, is going to be spent on in-country support for refugees and asylum seekers. Right? So this is up from £1 billion last year, £500 million the year before. And this was a big news story, partly because it tapped into this sense of what the Independent Commission on Aid Impact actually called unwarranted largesse of the Home Office, spending aid money in this unwarranted generosity towards refugees, right? So that language slightly comes from, if we're going to be generous, right, some concern from people in the aid world, sort of NGOs and aid contractors who feel like they're not able to spend the money externally on the world's poorest. That's not what development money should be doing. But it also taps into this idea that we shouldn't be spending that much on refugees, right? And in the official development statistics released by the government, they said, okay, that this increase over the last few years is because of the increased accommodation costs for the ever-increasing number of asylum seekers, right? But, again, if you look at the number of asylum seekers in the UK, that doesn't track, right? The amount spent internally on accommodation for asylum seekers, which is where most of the money goes, that proportion of the aid budget has been rising independently of the number of asylum seekers in the UK, right? It's a kind of deliberate reallocation of development spending towards in-country refugee support that can count as development spending, which for this government has a seemingly pleasing dual effect of reducing the amount of money they actually spend externally on what we'd normally think of as development, and also kind of igniting widespread frustration around spending development internally, right? Even to the point that the development watchdogs, whose job it is to make sure the money helps the world's poorest, are calling this unwarranted largesse, right? I think Nadia might have mentioned briefly about the amount of money that is made of asylum seeker accommodation as well. And just if you're not familiar, because one of the things I do in my day job is look at spreadsheets of invoices to the Home Office and FCDO of what they've been spending aid money on. And this unwarranted largesse is not really going to refugees or asylum seekers. It's going to providers of accommodation, which is, you might be familiar with news stories about the sort of squalid and substandard accommodation that's being provided by people like Serco. In 2019, Serco got a £2.1 billion contract, Mears got a £1.3 billion contract, and Clear Springs got a £996 million contract to administer refugee and asylum seeker housing, right? And that spending seems to have increased in the last year. All of that spending has not been entirely published. The other place this money goes is to councils to support resettlement schemes for particularly Ukrainian and Afghan refugees under specific schemes. And the amount that councils are given per refugee is ever decreasing, right? And this is to support housing, finding work, schooling, language, all kinds of other support. And there's less and less money per refugee as time goes on. And there was some recent work by the Reparative Centre looking at how this is becoming a real problem for councils being able to provide this support, because they can't keep experienced people in their jobs because the money keeps disappearing and everyone's on sort of these really short-term contracts, right? And that's against the backdrop of 15 billion disappearing from council budgets over the last 10 years, right? And I think this again speaks to what Nadia was talking about, the kind of lack of willingness to attend to the structural crises in sort of public welfare provision in the UK. And in the framing of this story, even from the aid watchdog that's supposed to be concerned with vulnerable people, the poorest, using this language of unwarranted largesse, disguising the fact that people are making profit of substandard housing, disguising the fact that a lot of that money is actually going to sort of inadequately plug gaps in staffed councils who are supposed to be providing refugee support services. You see the kind of development budget becoming weaponized in cultural wars, right? And one of the, just to try and bring it back around to this question of reparations and what it might take for the UK's aid budget to be reallocated towards some kind of reparatory project, it would take a lot, right? That's clear. But in the last 5-10 years, increasingly, all the sort of mechanisms around accountability and aid spending have been set up around the interests of the British taxpayer, right? So this was part of the Conservative One World Conservatism Green Paper in 2019. We've got to spend this wisely in the interests of the British taxpayer. We've got to have value for money in terms of poverty reduction for the interests of the British taxpayer. And you're spending all this money on refugees is not good interest for the British taxpayer in terms of their aid spending, right? And this is a really appealing language that owes a lot to DFID and now FCDO's sort of anxiety about the taxpayers' alliance, and sort of even adopting their language of like, it's taxpayers' money, it's not public money, right? But as Gurminder's research shows, it's kind of neither, right? Because a lot of what we think of as taxpayer-funded services were, established, funded by wealth extracted from colonial possessions, right? And when you think about value for money for the British taxpayer as your measure for seeing, is our development money doing good? It's impossible to sort of, you allied what you should be thinking about if you want to try and think about that budget being put to reparatory use, which is that the things we think of as British taxpayer funded, and that's always a narrow and exclusionary, were actually funded in large part by wealth extraction from imperial possessions. So I guess that's a way of saying that the technical language around the aid budget has kind of been sucked into this cultural wars framing, and there are even people in the sector kind of participating in this. The idea that we should be alarmed about this because of the interests of the British taxpayer is again another kind of less marked as a cultural wars thing, because it sounds technical, it sounds like it's about audit and accountability and value for money, but it's as much a part of this cultural wars framing and this disguise of where wealth comes from and how we should actually be thinking about development in terms of reparation. I've probably spoken for too long, so I really to.
I mean, one of the things that we wanted to do with this session was to think about the relationship between taxpayers, ideas of development and reparations. And in a sense, Paul has set out very nicely the ways in which this idea of who pays tax and what one is entitled to because one pays tax is a central part of the way in which much politics is organised in Britain. And what I wanted to do is to sort of broaden that scope to actually ask us to think about where did the taxation come from that enabled the British welfare state, for example, to be established. So there's a story, and I don't know if any of you have seen, is it Ken Loach's Spirit of 45, and the sort of hagiography around the establishment of the British welfare state, where it's presented very much as a national project. It's something that was achieved after the two world wars as a consequence of recompense that was being made for those soldiers and their families who had fought in the world wars. And so there was this idea that the welfare state was a response to that. But one of the things that we might want to remember is that the world wars were not fought by the British nation. They were fought by the British Empire. A number of the soldiers who lost their lives across the fields of Europe were from the Empire, and a lot of the resources that actually funded the war and enabled it to happen also came from the colonies. India was colonized at the time, and it was required to give a gift to Britain of £100 million at that time. So you can imagine what £100 million then would be today. This was called a voluntary gift, but one can imagine what voluntary means in the context of colonization. So why taxation, I think, is important for us to think about is because it's part of what constructs the idea of the nation. As a citizen, you pay tax to the government, and the government then gives you something in response to that. And there's this idea that citizens pay tax and the government organizes, the institutions and so on. But if we were to recognize that this imagined community of the nation isn't constructed on the basis of taxes paid by its national citizens, but also by colonial subjects, then how would that change the nature of obligation that taxation is otherwise supposed to demonstrate? Now, one of the key expenses of the state for which income tax was initially raised was war. However, over the 19th century, the military costs of the British state were outsourced to India. So basically, all the wars that Britain fought in across the 19th century and onwards were paid by Indian citizens. As Christopher Bailey notes, both through indirect means of tribute as well as directly through the overseas use of the Indian army, the company state sustained the domestic military fiscal machine. So what this meant was that Indian peasants bore the costs of the British world role, in a sense, both in terms of supplying the men who would go on to fight in these wars, as well as supplying the income which was used by the British state to be able to execute those wars. British taxpayers within Britain were exempted from paying income tax. So the working class and the middle class in Britain didn't pay any income tax until after the First World War. When Britain took over direct control of India in 1860, it established an income tax in India. This income tax was used, 3/4 of it went to the Imperial Treasury in Westminster, and only 1 rupee in 100 was used for local purposes. And so in that sense, the tax that was raised wasn't used for local processes. It wasn't used to establish government in India, but actually came directly to Westminster. That money was used for everything and anything that the British state wished, including providing welfare provision for people within Britain. Now, when the British state took over direct rule of India from 1860, over the next 40 to 50 years saw the most intense period of famine that the subcontinent had ever seen. These were famines that were a direct consequence of colonial policy. They were not to do with the failure of the rains or the failure of the harvest and so on, because this is a land that has often seen erratic weather conditions and so on, but in the past, those erratic weather conditions may have led to shortages, but didn't lead to death-producing famines. In the 40 years after the British government took over direct control of India, you saw a number of famines which led, at conservative estimates, to the deaths of over 14 million people. And during that period, it might have thought that the income tax that had been raised might be redistributed to help mitigate against the effects of famine. But this was explicitly disallowed. So it was not allowed to use the tax that was raised from Indian subjects in order to mitigate against the famines, because in the language of the time, if you support the poor and the poor then reproduce, all you're doing is creating further problems for the future by increasing the population. So this was the utilitarian sort of thinking that was there at the time, and it was a central part of government policy. So in a way, I guess what I'm trying to do is flesh out this notion of where does the colonial wealth come from. So Paul mentioned, that much of what goes on in Britain is funded from outside. But I think it's not often well known the extent to which that wealth from overseas funds what goes on in Britain. There was a wonderful report that I found by Richard Temple, who was the Secretary of the British Statistical Society, or the Royal Statistical Society. And he wrote a report in 1884 which detailed where all the money came from. And he identified that the British state had under its control £203 million. And this came from about 100 million came from the taxes of people within Britain, but another 103 came from the taxes of people in the colonies, the majority of which came from India, but also other colonial territories that were under British rule at the time. So over half of the wealth that was at the direct disposal of the British government came from its colonies. That's what enabled all institutions to be funded. So if we're thinking about what was to become the National Health Service, if we're thinking about education, if we're thinking about things as basic as building roads and having street lights, and let alone thinking about art institutions, museums, galleries, etc. So this is all funded through the taxation that comes in. And don't forget then that the British colonial administrators who were in India also brought back a huge amount of money through private enterprise and profit. So art galleries, country houses, etc. are then funded through this wealth that's brought back. In the early period of British colonisation, Macaulay writes, that effectively the English who go to India are bringing back, that treasure flows as an ocean from India to Britain. And Utsa Patnaik, who's an Indian economist, has recently sought to calculate the extent to which this, what the extent of this wealth was over 200 years of British colonisation, which includes the East India Company and then direct British rule, and she estimates it at being £45 trillion. Now, I'm never quite clear what the difference is between a million, a billion, and a trillion. So I looked it up. Now, if I was to give you £1 a second, it would take a minute to get £60, right? It would take something like 3 days. Correct me if I'm wrong, because I've suddenly forgotten the exact figures, but it's about, if it took you 3 days to get £1 million, it would take you about 13 years to get 1 billion. It would take you 317 centuries to get 1 trillion. So that's the difference in scale, from sort of around 3 years, I think it's 3 years to 31 years to 317 centuries, if we're thinking about the scale. And Britain extracted 45 trillion from India across 2 centuries. And so in that sense, if we're thinking about issues of inequality in the present, there's a tendency often to think about inequality as somehow natural. It just exists. And if you think about poverty somewhere else, it's like, oh, well, I could give charity to help them over there because they're so poor. If, however, we were to reconsider the fact that poverty and inequality are not natural, but have been produced through processes that make us rich at the same time as they make them poor, then addressing inequality might be more adequately reframed as an aspect of justice, as an aspect of redistribution. if we believe in a world that's fair, then what would we need to do to address the fact that our wealth, and by our wealth I'm talking about all of us in this room, because if we're in this room, there are reasons, we're wealthy. If we're not in this room, then there's that sort of issue. So it's not an argument around identity or those sorts of things. It is an argument about thinking about who lives the consequences of the structures that have been produced through historical processes. And what responsibility do we have if we're at the less sharp end of those structures to try and mitigate the ongoing consequences of this? And this is why, to link it back to the argument around sort of aid and reparation, I'm not persuaded that aid is the solution to these inequalities, because it also relies on a logic that suggests, oh, well, we're good people and we're going to help others because it's the right thing to do. If instead of aid we use reparations provides a very different frame. It's a frame that says we recognize that the wealth that we have is a consequence of historical processes that have produced inequality. What responsibility might we wish to take upon ourselves to rectify those inequalities? And this isn't an issue of blame or of pointing fingers or of any of those sorts of things. It's simply to say, if we don't wish the world to be configured as it is, why has it come to be configured this way, and what could we do to make it differently? And so in that sense, the relationship from sort of taxation to reparations, I think, is an attempt to highlight the sort, because I think, Alan, I agree with you absolutely that one of the things is that we need to contest the outright lies that get presented in what's framed as the culture wars. But there's also an aspect that I just think people don't know. People don't know that the British welfare state wasn't established through the taxes of the British people. It was established through the taxes of the British colonies, effectively. And so if the working class didn't pay taxes that contributed to the welfare state, then why is there a language? I mean, there was a classic book by, Amit was just mentioning it, by Dench, Gavron, and I've forgotten the third person, on the New East End. And in there, they talked about the hostility that the white working class had towards immigrants, because these immigrants were claiming an entitlement to the welfare state. And they, as scholars, said, well, it's understandable that these people should be hostile because they see these people coming in whose families won't have paid into the welfare state and yet already have access to it. Given that working class people in Britain didn't pay taxes until after the First World War, and Indian colonial subjects paid income tax from 1860, it's much more likely that my ancestors paid taxes that contributed to the establishment of the British welfare state than most of the working class or middle class in Britain. So how do we use that to argue for a more generous politics?